So, South Sudan is a really interesting and heartbreaking case of a country that has this possibility for huge amounts of natural resources and the benefits from them, improving the lives of the citizens within their country, combined with a history of conflict and strife between groups in South Sudan as well as the rest of Sudan before independence in 2011. It is a landlocked country in Central or Eastern Africa, and it is the world's newest country, created in 2011. Hopefully, the videos gave you a bit of context about what's going on right now and the living standards and what the human security implications are for a lack of government resources, paying people in hospitals to be able to provide people enough food to eat. That doesn't get as much attention as everything else that's going on in the world. So you have hundreds of thousands of people in need, millions of people who have fled the country, the largest refugee camp in the world, cropped up in a matter of weeks in over the border in Uganda after the fighting started in 2013, and you really just see long-term implications of it, as well as the role that oil has played in leading to conflict as well as negotiating power with the Sudanese government, as well as giving the two sides in the conflict incentives to work together that can provide something approximating stability or ceasefires over the last year or so. So let's talk a little bit more about South Sudan, and it's another one of those cases when explanations for conflict can be put at a couple of different levels of analysis, right? Is it the structural resource allocation geographically that South Sudan has, as well as its landlocked nature? Is it the history of conflict going back to the 1980s, the colonial system put in by the British, one of the tensest moments of the British and French in the 19th century occurred when two expeditionary parties came into conflict in the 19th century. But it's also an explanations for conflict that you can put at the individual level as well. These three men are crucial to understanding South Sudan's independence as well as its current difficulties with the president and Riek Machar, the opposition leader, former vice president, as well as John Garang. You might not have heard that much about John Garang now. He is someone who helped shape the evolution of the conflict in the unified Sudan going back to the 1980s. A lot of YouTube documentaries about him if you're curious. His death in 2005, I think, made independence from the rest of Sudan inevitable. He was one that was advocating for keeping South Sudan as part of a unified Sudan. Only a couple months after he joined the government in Khartoum, after not being able to go to Khartoum for decades, his helicopter went down under mysterious circumstances, and his death in 2005 was crucial to his nation's conflicts in the same way that I think that Ahmad Massoud was in Afghanistan, independence leader of the Northern Alliance, who was killed by an assassin just days before the 9/11 attacks. If he had survived, he would have been a unifying figure in Afghanistan that people said could have changed the dynamic of Afghan politics in the last 19 years. So John Garang had a similar kind of power role as a rebel commander and ability to bring together different factions for political gain. So these two competing leaders, the president and Riek Machar, are those who speak for their different groups and have played an outsized role in South Sudan going back decades. Riek Machar has a really interesting history. Read a book about his wife, who ended up being killed in Kenya a couple of decades ago. So all three have had really interesting lives and shaping South Sudanese politics. South Sudan, you see here in the UCDP website the extent to which the violence, including that against civilians, has spread across the entire country. You have the violence escalating, but now has reached a rough kind of stable point the last couple of years. Oil production is huge in a couple of the different states, and the pipelines going towards the north. Oil production facilities are stationary things, and not just in South Sudan, but oil production facilities are often targets for attacks, for kidnappings, for a whole host of activities that rebel groups might want to try to get attention or to try to damage the economic capacity of the government that they're trying to fight. Governments themselves have, in South Sudan and in Sudan, know more about the Sudanese case before independence, often use violence to displace people who had traditionally lived on the land in order to be able to produce oil in certain areas. And so the oil production is both a magnet for violence as well as an excuse to try to displace people in order to be able to produce. And so you see this this article from 2013 talking about the Poloch oil fields. This is an area that has been a target going back since 2013. Oil fields, of course, have become a battleground during this conflict because of the importance that it has. If you want to hurt the government, you want to hurt their pocketbook, right? And this is a way to do so. A number of the international corporations that operate in these areas have invested in private security. And oh my God, one of Meg Ryan's worst movies with Russell Crowe was about negotiating an oil employee's kidnapping. God, this is before all you were born. But yeah, oil fields can be a source both for cultural creations as well as used for violence. You see the amount of oil that's been exported over time since independence. You see the brown, that's the South Sudanese production. That you've seen relatively stable exports through the 2013 and before, but not nearly as much since before independence. The uncertainty, the fee disputes, South Sudan wanted Sudan to pay lower fees that were more indexed to the price of oil, and because of the targeting of oil fields as well as the insecurity, that production, this is the most recent data that I was able to find in 2018, this is substantially lower, right? About 50% lower than it was before independence. And so combine that with the lowering price for oil, and you have a substantial decrease in the amount of rents that the government has to be able to provide essential services to people within their borders. And yeah, the New York Times, they have this recent article from last year saying that the efforts to try to protect these oil fields, oil companies can fund militias that can be accused of atrocities. The systematic abuse and rape of citizens as a means for control is unfortunately one of those systematic features of this conflict and a number of other conflicts around the world. And so you see this intersection between economics, government institutions, government revenue, and abuses of citizens in these countries that have weak capacity, but enough capacity to potentially oppress people within the country. Also really interestingly, there's been some recent FinCEN reporting done just in the last couple months, Panama Papers a couple of years ago, there has been an increasing amount of information about illicit or secret transfers of money, often related to people in control of oil-producing states. This Taking of South Sudan report by the Century ties the current president and a number of members of his family to through corporations by being controlling members of corporations in a whole host of different countries. You see, including in Australia there, that you see the connections with political leadership to family members as well as direct people who might benefit from the resource exports. So South Sudan is similar to a lot of these cases. And it's always difficult to try to control these resources, as well as to find out what money is going where. Right, in the international financial system, all it takes is a computer, and you can try to find means to launder or hide the origins of a whole bunch of different resources. This Palok oil field again crops up in these oil fields and attacking and kidnappings. This is, you see where it is in the periphery of the South Sudan. Up in the far north, there's been a bunch of attacks there. And yeah, you see how important securing these resources are just to the pure survival of the government. If the government's going to be able to provide income and food for their soldiers, they need to be able to maintain control of these oil fields in order to produce these rents. One other side note that I thought worth mentioning for those of you who are interested in resources and conflict is the country-specific efforts at trying to increase transparency. There's been efforts to try to look at government repression that's increased over time, government efforts at using violence. This is a local South Sudanese non-governmental organization, similar ones that I can think of in Sri Lanka and a bunch of other countries. Ushahidi and others have tried to make open source platforms reporting these kind of violence easier, and that's given a better, if incomplete, nature of what these conflict dynamics are, where they're actually happening. You see that cluster up there near the oil field, 26 attacks, 63 attacks up in the north, that you can get a better understanding of what relationships there are between resource production and instability. And it makes me think of incentives for peace, as well as one of the current research projects that I have. This article from last year talked about how South Sudan is trying to provide security. There's the attacks in 2017, right? And 2018, 2019, there was trying to create some kind of stability to increase the amount of foreign direct investment within the country. There's been repeated calls, as the video kind of makes clear, for trying to open up and to try to increase investment in these areas. However, it's difficult to try to make credible commitments given the instability of the area. And also, I think it's interesting seeing that the destination state, China, has also recently, I think this is from a couple days ago, China has called for more peaceful resolution of the conflict, which connects to external interventions, right? That the literature that we read for this week and that I just talked about in an earlier section, how external interventions can give incentive to create stability in order to maintain these resource access and to reduce the chance for disruption. So China has been playing an increasing role in trying to encourage investment as well as encourage stability. So that country level is one way at trying to encourage stability. Another one would be multilateral, non-governmental and governmental efforts. And so there's a couple of videos that I have before my next section that I'd like you to take a quick look at. This one is the one that actually has the two parts, looking at the EITI transparency in investments in these kind of oil projects as a way to try to reduce conflict. One of the readings talks about the Sao Tome agreement to try to control resources through having the opposition involved and creating a fund for trying to, it was the Humphreys article, to try to reduce the chance that the resource rents get distracted and diverted. This is something that's also been a case in a number of other countries in South Tome since 2005, as found it difficult to try to maintain those commitment mechanisms to save the money and not spend it right away. So let's learn a little bit about EITI with the videos, and then I'll get into the last section, the international efforts at trying to provide transparency in two types of resources, one, extractive industries as a general type, and then diamonds with the Kimberley process about a specific resource.